You think you know how a story's going to go. A lonely man, a forgotten woman, a second chance under a big empty sky. But some stories, they have ghosts, and those ghosts have secrets. Walton Greaves stepped off his wagon into the dust of Clearwater Station, and the heat felt like a physical weight on his shoulders. 3 years. 3 years since he'd laid his wife Constance in the ground, and still, the world felt wrong. The ranch was dying, the bank was circling like a vulture, and the list of supplies in his pocket felt like the last words of a condemned man. He was here to buy flour and nails, but really he was here to beg the banker for one more week. A week he knew he wouldn't get, and that's when he saw her. Sitting on the station bench, ramrod straight, was a woman who looked like she was carved from disappointment. Her traveling dress was fine Eastern tweed, completely wrong for the grit of the prairie. Her hands clutched a crumpled telegram like it was the only thing holding her together. He could see it from across the platform. She was a ship wrecked on a shore she never meant to find. He knew the feeling. He lived it every single day. His boots clomped on the wooden planks, a sound that seemed too loud in the sleepy afternoon. He was just going to walk past, mind his own business, but something in the way she held her chin up, a kind of stubborn pride in the face of total disaster, reminded him of, well, it reminded him of Constance. "Ma'am," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. He tipped his hat. "Walton Greaves. Looks like you're waiting on a train that ain't coming." Her eyes, the color of new spring sage, met his. There was no pity in them, just a deep, settled weariness. "I'm afraid you're correct, Mr. Greaves. It seems my judgment is as poor as my luck." Her voice was educated, crisp, but it couldn't hide the tremor. He already knew the story. Small towns talk. This was the woman from Philadelphia, the one who'd answered Virgil Snopes' matrimonial ad. Virgil, the son of the very banker who was about to ruin him. "Virgil Snopes," Walton stated, not a question. A faint blush crept up her neck. "His mother sent a telegram. I am unsuitable." The word hung in the air, ugly and final. "Too old," she said, "for childbearing." Walton felt a flash of hot anger. The Snopes family, with their fat hands and cold hearts, deciding a woman's worth like she was livestock. He looked at her, at the strength in her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes, and then he looked across the street at the bank that held the deed to his life's work, the bank owned by the family that had just discarded this woman like a piece of trash. And an idea, a terrible, desperate, brilliant idea sparked in his mind. It wasn't about romance. It wasn't about kindness. It was about survival. It was about war. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and steady, "my name is Walton Greaves. I own a ranch 10 miles from here. It's failing. The bank, Virgil Snopes' father's bank, is about to take it from me. I need a wife. Not for comfort, not for love, for a loophole. The foreclosure laws are different for a married man with a family to support. It's a stay of execution. A few more months is all." Her eyes widened. This was not the conversation she was expecting. "What are you proposing, Mr. Greaves?" she whispered. "I'm proposing a business arrangement," he said, the words tasting like rust and gunpowder. "You need a roof. I need time. We get married. Today. We file the papers. It stops the foreclosure clock. In return, you get half of whatever I have left, which isn't much. A home, safety, a name." He paused, letting the weight of the offer settle. "Any man who thinks your years are a weakness is a fool. I think they're your strength. So what do you say, Miss Delo? Shall we be each other's salvation? Or at least, shall we be Virgil Snopes' worst nightmare?" The station clock ticked, each second a hammer blow. A tumbleweed skittered past. Rosalind Delo looked from Walton's weathered, honest face to the smug gold lettering on the bank across the street. She thought of the 2,000 miles she'd traveled, the dreams she'd packed, the humiliation of being dismissed by a telegram. A slow fire started burning behind her sage-green eyes. She stood up, her posture no longer defeated, but defiant. "Mr. Greaves," she said, her voice clear as a bell, "my name is Rosalind, and I accept your proposal. What do you think? Was this a brilliant move or the biggest mistake of their lives?" Let me know in the comments below. The Justice of the Peace, Hollis Weatherby, looked at them over his spectacles like they were a pair of talking coyotes. His eyebrows, which were already halfway to his hairline, seemed to be attempting an escape. "A marriage license," he squeaked. "Now?" "That's right," Walton said, his hand resting on Rosalind's elbow. It wasn't a gesture of affection. It was a signal of alliance. "Today, if you can manage it, Hollis." News like this doesn't walk in a town like Clearwater. It gallops. By the time they walked from the courthouse to the small, sun-bleached church, a crowd had gathered. Whispers followed them like stray dogs. Thelma Snopes, the banker's wife, and the very woman who'd penned the cruel telegram, stood with her gaggle of friends, her fan beating the air furiously as if trying to ward off the sheer audacity of it all. The Reverend, a young man with more nerves than conviction, wrung his hands. Are you certain about this? This is highly irregular." Walton looked him dead in the eye. "Reverend, my ranch is about to be seized. This woman was just left stranded hundreds of miles from home. The only thing irregular here is how much bad luck two people can have in one day. We're just trying to make it regular again. Now, are you going to marry us or not?" The ceremony was short. The words were ancient, but their meaning was brand new, forged in desperation. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, a strange quiet fell over the small church. It wasn't reverence, it was shock. Rosalind felt a phantom weight lift, the weight of her failed dreams, only to be replaced by something heavier, colder, more real. The weight of a contract. As they walked back to Walton's wagon, the whispers of the crowd were a roar in her ears. She saw Virgil Snopes standing with his mother, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He looked at her, then at Walton, and in his eyes she saw not just surprise, but something else, something that looked almost like fear. Why would he be afraid? It was a question that lodged itself in her mind, a tiny splinter of unease. The ride to the ranch was silent. The wagon seat was worn smooth, the harness meticulously mended. This was a man who took care of his things, even as they fell apart around him. "How bad is it?" Rosalind finally asked, her voice quiet. Walton's knuckles were white on the reins. "Worse than I let on," he admitted. "After Constance passed, I made some bad choices, listened to some bad advice. The debt's a monster, Rosalind. This marriage, it doesn't slay the monster. It just keeps it outside the door for a little while longer." The ranch house appeared over the rise, and Rosalind's heart sank. It wasn't a house, it was a tombstone. Peeling paint, a sagging porch, and an entire wing half-finished, its wooden skeleton exposed to the elements. It was a monument to broken promises. But the land around it was good, honest land. She could feel it. There was still a heartbeat here, faint as it was. The inside was worse. It was perfectly, unnervingly clean. But it was frozen in time. A sewing basket sat by the hearth, a piece of fabric still in its hoop. An apron hung on a peg by the stove. A book lay open on a small table, its page marked with a dried flower. It was Constance's house. They were just ghosts in it. I haven't touched a thing," Walton stammered, his voice thick with a grief so profound it felt like a third person in the room. "Couldn't bring myself to." Rosalind walked over to the mantelpiece. There were photographs, Walton and a smiling, vibrant woman, Constance. And in every photo, she wore a distinctive silver locket, shaped like a hummingbird. Rosalind nodded slowly. She understood grief. But this wasn't just grief. This was a shrine, and it was suffocating. That night, Walton laid out blankets for himself in the barn. He couldn't bring himself to sleep in his own house with her there, and he certainly couldn't sleep in his and Constance's bed. Rosalind lay in that bed alone, the sheets smelling faintly of lavender and old memories. She stared up at the ceiling, listening to the prairie wind moan around the eaves. She was Mrs. Greaves. She had a home. She was safe. But she had never felt more like an intruder in her entire life. She thought of the look in Virgil Snopes' eyes, the fear, and she thought of this house, a perfect, heartbreaking museum of a dead woman. She had a terrible feeling that the foreclosure wasn't the only monster they had to fight. The first weeks were a careful, silent dance. Two strangers orbiting each other in a house full of ghosts. Rosalind was a surprise. The woman from Philadelphia, with her soft hands and educated voice, woke before dawn, milked the lone cow, tended the chickens, and attacked the neglected garden with a ferocity that startled Walton. She was a survivor. He saw that now. She wasn't just running from humiliation. She was running toward a fight. Any fight. Walton watched her, a silent, brooding presence. He'd work from sunup to sundown, mending fences, tending the small herd of cattle that was left, his movements heavy with the weight of his past. He spoke little, and when he did, it was about the ranch, the weather, the work. Never about Constance, never about the future. One rainy afternoon, driven inside, Rosalind found herself drawn to a large, roll-top desk in the parlor. Constance's desk. It was the one thing in the house that seemed truly personal, truly lived in. It was also locked. Walton kept the key on his watch chain, a silent sentinel. But Rosalind, exploring the room, ran her fingers along the side and felt a small, almost invisible button. A secret catch. With a soft click, a thin side drawer slid open. Inside was not a key, it was a ledger. Constance's personal account book. Rosalind opened it. The first pages were filled with neat, elegant script detailing household expenses. But as she flipped further, the entries changed. Large sums of money, withdrawals, payments to names she didn't recognize. And then, near the end, 3 years ago, the entries became frantic, messy. The numbers were staggering. It wasn't just a few bad investments, as Walton had said. This was a fortune that had vanished into thin air. The last entry, dated a week before Constance's death, was almost illegible. Just 2 words, scribbled with a shaking hand. He knows. A chill snaked down Rosalind's spine. She snapped the book shut just as Walton's heavy boots sounded on the porch. She slid the drawer closed, her heart hammering against her ribs. He had lied to her, not just by omission. The story of bad investments was a cover. Something else had happened here. Something that had bled this ranch dry and maybe, just maybe, had cost Constance her life. That night, over a meager supper of beans and cornbread, Rosalind decided to push. "I want to help, Walton," she said, her voice even. "With the books, with the finances. I was a teacher, but I'm good with numbers. Let me see where we stand, truly." Walton's jaw tightened. He stopped chewing. "There's nothing to see. It's a mess, I told you." "Then let me help you clean it up," she pressed. "We're partners in this, remember? Your debt is my debt now. I have a right to know the full extent of it." His eyes were dark, guarded. "It's my burden to carry, Rosalind." "And it's my home you're about to lose," she shot back, her voice sharper than she intended. "I didn't trade one impossible situation for another, just to sit here and watch it all burn down. If we're going to fight the bank, we need a plan, and we can't make a plan without the truth." He stared at her for a long moment, a battle raging behind his eyes. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to pull up rocks from the bottom of his soul, he nodded. He walked to the mantel, took down a small ornate box, and handed her a key. Not the key from his watch chain, a different one. "The main account books are in the study," he said, his voice flat. "Knock yourself out." Rosalind's blood ran cold. He was directing her to a different set of books. He was actively hiding the truth. She took the key, her hands steady despite the tremor she felt inside. She went into the small, dusty study and opened the official ledgers. They were just as he said, a mess of missed payments and mounting interest. The story of a slow, sad decline. But the numbers here didn't match the massive sums she'd seen in Constance's private ledger. Not even close. The official debt was bad. It was foreclosure bad. But the money that had disappeared from Constance's book, that was something else entirely. It was a secret debt, a shadow debt, that had nothing to do with the bank. And Walton was still protecting it. She now knew 2 things for certain. 1, her new husband was hiding a devastating secret connected to his first wife. And 2, whatever that secret was, it was powerful enough to destroy them long before the bank ever could. The next morning, Rosalind announced her plan. It came to her in the dead of night, a single candle against the crushing darkness. "We'll start a school," she said, setting a cup of coffee in front of Walton at the kitchen table. He blinked at her, confused. "A school?" "Right here, in the unfinished wing," she explained, her voice gaining momentum. "The nearest schoolhouse is 20 miles away. The children on these outlying ranches get no education at all. Their parents would pay. Not much, maybe, but it would be steady income. Cash. Something to show the bank we're not just waiting for the end." Walton looked out the window at the skeletal framework of the North Wing, the monument to his and Constance's abandoned dreams. "That was supposed to be the nursery," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Dreams change, Walton," Rosalind said softly, but with a spine of steel. "Sometimes we have to build something new on the foundations of the old ones." He saw the logic in it. He couldn't deny the sense it made. Reluctantly, he agreed. The work gave them a purpose, a common goal that wasn't just survival. Together they hammered and sawed, turning the shell of a nursery into a bright, hopeful schoolroom. And as they worked, a piece of the ice between them began to thaw. He saw her determination, her refusal to be beaten. She saw the skilled craftsman in him, the man who had built this house with his own two hands. But their project did not go unnoticed. News of the rancher's school reached town, and it reached the ears of Thelma Snopes. She saw it not as a desperate attempt to survive, but as a direct challenge. This Eastern woman, this cast-off, was not only refusing to disappear quietly, she was setting herself up as a pillar of the community. It was an affront. The rumors started small, whispers in the general store. "She's too refined to be a rancher's wife. It's a disgrace to the memory of poor Constance." Then they got uglier. Thelma Snopes, with her venomous tongue, started digging. She must have written to contacts in Philadelphia. Because one day as Rosalind was buying chalk in town, Virgil Snopes confronted her outside the mercantile. "I know about you," he sneered, his face pale and sweaty. "I know what you did in Philadelphia. You think you can come here and pretend to be some saintly school teacher?" Rosalind's heart froze. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" he said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "They told us all about the scandal. The professor you were involved with, a married man. How you were quietly dismissed from your position to avoid a scene. My mother was right to send you away. You're damaged goods, Miss Dello. Or should I say, Mrs. Greaves." He spat the name like it was poison. Rosalind stood there, stunned into silence. It was true. A foolish, youthful mistake that had cost her everything and shadowed her for years. A secret she thought she'd buried 2,000 miles away. How could they have known? The campaign against her escalated. Parents who had expressed interest in the school suddenly grew cold. Supplies she ordered from town were mysteriously delayed. One evening, they woke to find the words, "Go home adulteress," painted in crude white letters across their new schoolhouse wall. Walton flew into a rage, grabbing his rifle, ready to ride into town and confront Snopes. "No!" Rosalind stopped him, her hand on his arm. "That's what they want. They want you to be the hot-headed rancher. They want us to fall apart." "So we do nothing?" he roared, gesturing at the vile words. "We let them slander you? Disgrace you?" "No," she said, her eyes blazing with a cold fire he'd never seen before. "We don't do nothing. We fight back. But not with fists. With our minds." She took a deep breath. "He's right, Walton, about Philadelphia. There was a scandal. I was young, and I was stupid. But I am not that person anymore, and I will not let them use my past to destroy our future." That night she didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with the real account books, the ones from the study, in Constance's secret ledger. She worked by lamplight, comparing names, dates, and numbers. The official debt to the bank was one thing, but the vast sums of money disappearing from Constance's accounts were different. They were regular payments, always in cash, to a holding company she'd never heard of, Clearwater Ventures. She had a sickening hunch. She rode into town the next day, not to the mercantile, but to the county records office. She claimed she was researching a historical article, a plausible lie for an educated Easterner. She spent hours poring over dusty incorporation documents, and then she found it. Clearwater Ventures, Incorporated 4 years ago. The list of officers was short. The president and sole shareholder, Mr. Alistair Snopes, the banker himself. The blood drained from her face. This wasn't just a foreclosure. It wasn't just bad blood over a jilted bride. This was a systematic, deliberate plot. Alistair Snopes hadn't just been Walton's banker. He had been blackmailing Constance. He had been slowly bleeding her, and the ranch dry for years. The bad investments Walton thought his wife had made were payments to the very man who was now moving in to take what was left. And what did Snopes have on Constance? What secret was so terrible she was willing to bankrupt her own husband to keep it hidden? The answer, Rosalind suspected, was still locked inside that roll-top desk. And she suddenly understood why Walton guarded that key on his watch chain, not just with grief, but with something that looked a lot like terror. He wasn't just protecting his wife's memory. He was protecting a secret he couldn't bear to face. The first storm of September came on like the wrath of God. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind screamed like a banshee. Lightning didn't just flash, it tore the heavens apart. Rosalind was grading the first hopeful batch of student papers, 3 children from a neighboring ranch whose parents had defied the Snopes smear campaign, when Walton burst through the door, rain and fury pouring off him. "The north fence is gone," he yelled over the howl of the wind. "Lightning strike. 50 yards of it, just vaporize. The cattle are scattering straight toward Black Creek." Black Creek, which was normally a gentle stream, would be a raging, murderous torrent in a storm like this. Rosalind was already on her feet, shedding her dress for the practical riding clothes Walton had bought her. "You're not going out there," he protested. "How many head?" she demanded, ignoring him as she pulled on a heavy rain slicker. 30, maybe more. It's my whole herd." "Then you need help," she said, meeting his panicked eyes with a look of absolute calm. She was no longer just a schoolteacher. She was a general in this war. "We are partners, Walton. We save the herd together, or we lose it together." The world outside was a nightmare of sound and water. Rain came down in sheets so thick it was hard to breathe. Lightning flashes offered terrifying, split-second glimpses of panicked cattle, their eyes white with terror, streaming through the broken fence line. The ground had turned to a slick, treacherous mud, but they rode into it, side by side. Rosalind was not a natural rider, but she was a determined one. She moved her horse with a cool-headed command that amazed Walton, cutting off steers that were heading for the ravine, turning them back toward the relative safety of the high pasture. They were a team, moving without words, their actions dictated by the chaos around them. A young calf, separated from its mother, bolted directly toward the roaring creek. Walton spurred his horse to intercept it, but his mount slipped in the sucking mud, nearly going down. Without a second of hesitation, Rosalind galloped past him, leaning low from her saddle, her arm outstretched. She managed to slap the calf's rump, turning it just as it reached the crumbling bank of the flood-swollen creek. It was a move of pure instinctual bravery. Hours passed in a blur of rain, mud, and terror. By the time the storm began to break, they had managed to round up every single animal. Soaked, freezing, and utterly exhausted, they herded the last of the cattle into the barn. As they stood there, dripping on the hay-strewn floor, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by something else. "I've never seen anything like that," Walton said, his voice raw with awe. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a business partner or an intruder, but as an equal. "The way you rode, the way you weren't even afraid." "Oh, I was afraid," she said, a small, weary smile touching her lips. She peeled off the slicker, shivering. "But I was more afraid of losing." He took a step closer. The air between them was charged, electric, just like the storm-lashed sky. He reached out and brushed a stray, wet strand of hair from her cheek. His fingers were rough, calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. "Thank you, Rosalind," he whispered. The front door creaked open behind them. They both turned. A small figure stood there, soaked and trembling. It was Martha, the 10-year-old daughter of their neighbor, one of Rosalind's students. "My pa, he didn't come home," the little girl sobbed. "He went out to check our fences before the storm hit, and he's not back. Ma sent me." We saw your lights. Walton's face hardened. He grabbed a dry lantern. Stay here with her, he ordered Rosalind. No, she said, grabbing another lantern. We go together. They found him an hour later, thrown from his horse, his leg broken and twisted at a sickening angle, lying half submerged in a ditch at the bottom of a washout. He was unconscious and losing heat fast. They couldn't move him alone. I'll ride for the doctor, Walton said. You stay with him. Keep him warm. Keep him awake if you can. For the second time that night, Rosalind was left in the heart of the storm's aftermath, this time with a man's life in her hands. She covered him with her own slicker, talking to him, shaking him gently, doing anything she could to fight off the creeping cold. It felt like an eternity before she saw the bobbing lights of lanterns in the distance. It was Walton and the doctor, and to her complete astonishment, 2 other ranchers, men who had previously shunned her, influenced by the Snopes' rumors. They had come because a neighbor was in trouble. Out here, some things were more important than town gossip. As they carefully loaded the injured man onto a makeshift stretcher, Rosalind saw it. Lying in the mud, half buried near where he'd fallen, was a silver locket shaped like a hummingbird. The chain was broken. It must have been knocked from his pocket in the fall. Her hand trembled as she picked it up. She had seen this locket before, in every single photograph of Constance Greaves on the mantelpiece. What in God's name was their neighbor doing with Constance's locket? The house was quiet again. The injured neighbor, Jed, was safe at the doctor's. Walton was out checking the fence repairs. Rosalind sat at the kitchen table, the silver hummingbird locket resting in her palm. It felt cold, heavy, a secret with weight. She knew she couldn't confront Walton with it. Not yet. He was already a man stretched to his breaking point. This would shatter him. No, she needed more. She needed the truth. All of it. That night, she waited until the house was dark and silent, until Walton's steady breathing from his room down the hall told her he was asleep. With a candle in one hand, she walked to the parlor, to the imposing roll-top desk that had belonged to Constance. She knew the main key was in the study. She knew Walton kept another key on his watch chain. She suspected that one opened the main compartment, but it was the small, hidden drawers she needed. She ran her fingers along the ornate carvings, searching for other catches, other secrets. And then she found it. Not a button, but a tiny piece of inlay that depressed when she pushed it. A section of the desk's side swung open, revealing not a drawer but a small, hidden compartment. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal. Constance's diary. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold it steady. This felt like a violation, a sacrilege. But she thought of the missing money, the blackmail, and the locket now tucked safely in her pocket. She had to know. She opened it to the last year. Constance's elegant script filled the pages, but the tone grew more and more frantic as the months went on. It was a chronicle of fear. Alistair knows everything. He came to the house today when Walton was in town. He smiled that horrible smile of his and told me he knows how the fire started. He said he has proof. He wants more money, always more money. Rosalind's breath hitched. A fire? She flipped back, her fingers flying through the pages. She found the entry. 4 years ago. The old barn burned down last night. A lamp overturned, Walton thinks. An accident. But it wasn't. It was me. I was careless. I was meeting Jed there. I never meant for it to happen. The shame is eating me alive. Walton could have been killed. We lost 3 prize bulls. It's my fault, all my fault. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. Constance wasn't having an affair with the banker. She was having an affair with their neighbor Jed. The fire wasn't an accident. It was caused by their secret meeting. And Alistair Snopes, the banker, had somehow found out. He wasn't just blackmailing her for money. He was using her secret to gain leverage, to ruin them, so he could pick up the pieces of their ranch for pennies on the dollar. The bad investments were hush money. Rosalind felt a wave of nausea. She looked at the last entry in the diary, written the day she died. I can't give him any more. There's nothing left. He's coming to the house this afternoon to tell Walton everything. I can't let him. I can't let Walton see the truth of what I am. There is only one way out. I will not let that snake destroy the one good thing in my life. I love him too much for that. Constance hadn't died from a simple illness. The timing, the despair in her words. Had she taken her own life to prevent Snopes from revealing her secret? Or, Rosalind's blood ran cold at the thought. Had Snopes visited that afternoon and done something to silence her forever? The town doctor had been old, easily persuaded. He would have signed off on anything for a powerful man like Snopes. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked in the hall. Rosalind slammed the diary shut, her heart leaping into her throat. She shoved it back into the compartment just as Walton appeared in the doorway, a lamp held high. Rosalind, what are you doing up? His eyes weren't angry. They were filled with a deep, bottomless sorrow. He looked from her face to the desk. He knew. He had always known she would find her way here. I couldn't sleep, she whispered, her voice trembling. He walked slowly into the room and sank into a chair. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. I found it after she died, he said finally, his voice a ghost of itself. Her diary. I read it. All of it. He looked up at her, his face a mask of agony. I knew about the affair. I knew about the fire. And I knew about the blackmail. Rosalind stared at him, speechless. But why didn't you do anything? Why let him keep taking from you? Why protect her? Because I loved her, he choked out, the words torn from him. And because I was a coward. I couldn't bear the shame of it. Jed was my friend. Constance. She was my world. If the truth came out, it would destroy her memory. It would destroy everything. So I let Snopes bleed me dry. I told myself it was my penance. For not being enough for her. For not seeing how unhappy she was. He finally broke. The grief he'd held in for 3 years pouring out of him in great shuddering sobs. Rosalind went to him, putting her hands on his shoulders. She wasn't his wife, not really, but she was his partner, and the war had just become terrifyingly clear. They weren't just fighting a banker for a piece of land. They were fighting a monster for the truth of a dead woman's life. And now Rosalind held the only 2 pieces of evidence that could expose it all. A dead woman's diary and a silver locket found in the mud. It was her word and a ghost's against the most powerful man in the county. The days that followed were charged with a new dangerous energy. The secret was out, shared between them in the dark of the night, and it had changed everything. The wall of grief that had separated them was gone, replaced by the grim bond of a shared enemy. They were no longer just a man and a woman sharing a roof. They were co-conspirators. The diary isn't enough, Rosalind said one evening, pacing the kitchen floor while Walton cleaned his rifle. It's her word. Snopes will say it's the fiction of a troubled woman. He'll paint her as unstable. He'll destroy her name to save his own. And the locket? Walton asked, his voice low. It proves Jed was there when he fell. It doesn't prove the affair, she reasoned. We need more. We need something Snopes can't deny. Her mind raced, connecting the dots. The blackmail payments, Clearwater Ventures. She remembered the coded financial notes in Constance's diary, the ones mixed in with her personal entries. They hadn't made sense before, but now with the full picture, she looked at them again. They weren't just notes, they were a record. Dates, amounts, and cryptic initials. Walton, she said, her voice electric with discovery, get me the official bank statements, the ones from the last 4 years. He retrieved the dusty box of papers from the study. For hours they sat at the table, a strange domestic scene of a husband and wife surrounded by financial documents, searching for a crime. Rosalind's finger traced the lines. She compared the dates of Constance's frantic diary entries with the dates of large, unexplained withdrawals from their accounts. They lined up perfectly, and then she saw the pattern. The withdrawals from their account were always followed, a day or 2 later, by deposits of a nearly identical amount into the public records of Clearwater Ventures. It was a clear, traceable path of extortion. We have him, she whispered, the words barely audible. This is the proof. He used his position as a banker to watch your accounts, to know exactly when you had money, and then he squeezed her for it, and he laundered it through his own shell company. They had the motive, the method, and the paper trail. The next day they rode to Jed's ranch. His wife met them at the door, her face etched with worry. Jed was laid up, his leg in a crude splint, his face pale with pain. Walton didn't waste words. He walked to the bedside and placed the silver hummingbird locket on the blanket. Jed's eyes filled with tears. I don't know how. I do, Walton said, his voice devoid of anger, filled only with a great, terrible sadness. I know everything, Jed. I've known for 3 years. The confession tumbled out of the injured man. The shame, the regret. He told them how Snopes had found them out, how he'd threatened to expose them both, how Constance had insisted on paying him off herself, trying to protect both her husband and her lover. The day she died, Jed choked out, she sent me a note. She said Snopes was coming. She told me to stay away, that she would handle it. I never saw her again. I've lived with that every day since. Now they had a witness. Their plan was simple and incredibly dangerous. They wouldn't go to the sheriff, who was known to be in Snopes' pocket. They would go straight to the source. They walked into the bank the next morning. The room fell silent. Alistair Snopes sat behind his polished desk, a portrait of smug authority. He smiled when he saw them, a predator's smile. Mr. and Mrs. Greaves, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Have you come to beg for another extension? I'm afraid the bank's patience has run out. Rosalind stepped forward and placed Constance's diary on the desk. We're not here about the loan, Mr. Snopes. Next to it, Walton placed the bank statements, with Rosalind's neat red circles around the damning transactions. Snopes' smile faltered. His eyes darted from the diary to the papers. A flicker of panic. This is your last chance, Walton said, his voice a low growl. You will write off our debt. All of it. You will sign over a confession admitting to extortion and blackmail, and then you will pack your bags and you will leave this town and never come back. Snopes laughed, a high, reedy sound. Are you insane? You have nothing. The ravings of a dead woman and some numbers you don't understand. Get out of my bank. Is that your final answer? Rosalind asked, her voice chillingly calm. It is, he sneered. Very well, she said. She turned not to Walton, but to the door. She opened it. Standing in the doorway were 3 men, the 3 other ranchers whose children attended her school, the men who had helped rescue Jed from the storm. One of them held a new, freshly printed flyer. In bold letters it read, Town Meeting Tonight, How Alistair Snopes Destroyed the Graves Ranch and Drove a Woman to Her Grave. All welcome. Evidence will be presented. The ranchers began handing the flyers to every customer in the bank, to every person on the street. Snopes' face went from white to purple. You wouldn't dare. Oh, I think we would, Rosalind said, her eyes like chips of ice. You see, you thought you could ruin us by spreading rumors about my past. You taught me a valuable lesson, Mr. Snopes. Words have power, and we have a story to tell, a true one, with proof. I wonder how your other clients will feel when they learn how you do business. I wonder how many of them you've also squeezed, also threatened. He was trapped. He could either be quietly ruined by their demands, or publicly and utterly destroyed by the truth. Checkmate. His composure shattered. He lunged across the desk, grabbing for the diary. That's mine, he shrieked. But Walton was faster. He grabbed Snopes' wrist, his farmer's strength easily overpowering the soft banker. You will not touch her things. Ever again. Defeated, Snopes collapsed back into his chair, a gasping, cornered animal. He knew he was beaten, but Rosalind had seen the look in his eyes as he'd lunged. It wasn't just the desperation of a man caught in a crime. It was the frantic terror of a man with an even darker secret to hide. And a horrifying thought struck her. What if Constance hadn't taken her own life? What if, on that final afternoon, Alistair Snopes had done more than just threaten her? They left the bank that day with a signed confession and a deed to the ranch, free and clear. It was a victory, but it felt hollow. The real truth, the darkest part of it, was still buried. That night, a strange, unnatural quiet settled over the ranch. They had won. The debt was gone. Snopes was exposed and preparing to leave town in disgrace. But there was no celebration. Walton stood on the porch, staring out at the dark prairie. It's not enough, he said, his voice heavy. He took her life from her, one piece at a time, with his threats. He might as well have killed her with his own 2 hands. Rosalind stood beside him. Maybe he did, Walton. The thought hung in the air between them, ugly and undeniable. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and something else. Smoke. Walton stiffened, his head snapping up. Do you smell that? They looked toward the horizon, in the direction of the barn. A faint orange glow was flickering against the dark clouds. It grew brighter, angrier. Fire, Walton breathed. The word a curse. They ran. Not toward the house, but toward the barn where their precious few cattle, the ones they had fought so hard to save from the storm, were sheltered. As they got closer, the glow became a blaze. Flames were already licking up the dry wooden walls. This was no accident. Not with a storm brewing. This was arson. This was Snopes's final desperate act of revenge. He couldn't have the ranch, so he would make sure they had nothing left to build on. But as they neared the barn, 2 figures on horseback burst from behind the structure, their faces illuminated by the firelight. They weren't just arsonists. They were carrying rifles. A shot rang out, splintering the fence post next to Walton's head. Get back to the house, he yelled at Rosalind, shoving her behind him. Get the rifle. There's no time, she screamed back, her eyes wide with terror and fury. The gunmen were circling, trying to drive them back, to keep them from saving the livestock. It was a cruel, calculated act of destruction. Suddenly, from the darkness to their left, another shot rang out. Not at them, but at one of the gunmen. The man cried out, his horse rearing as he clutched his shoulder. Walton and Rosalind spun around. Standing at the edge of their property line, a smoking rifle in his hands, was Jed, their neighbor. He was propped up on a crude crutch, his wife beside him, reloading a second rifle. They had seen the fire and had come running. Alistair Snopes sends his regards, one of the gunmen yelled, firing wildly. But then came another sound, the thunder of hooves, not 2 horses, but a dozen. The other ranchers, the parents of Rosalind's students, were riding hard toward the fire, drawn by the light in the sky. They were armed. They were angry. Snopes hadn't just attacked the Grievuses. He had attacked one of their own. The hired gunmen, seeing they were hopelessly outnumbered, turned and fled into the night. The fire was raging now, the barn groaning as its main beams began to surrender. The ranchers didn't hesitate. They formed a bucket brigade from the well, working with a desperate, synchronized rhythm. Walton, using his knowledge of the barn's structure, directed them, while Rosalind and the other women worked to calm the terrified animals in the nearby corral. They fought the fire for over an hour, a small army against an inferno. In the end, they couldn't save the barn. It collapsed into a mountain of embers and smoke. But they had saved the house, and they had saved every single animal. As the sun began to rise, painting the smoky sky in shades of pink and gray, the small community stood together, exhausted, soot-stained, but undefeated. They had faced the monster together, and they had won. The sheriff arrived, looking nervous. One of the captured arsonists, his shoulder crudely bandaged, was tied to a fence post. He had already confessed everything. He confirmed that Alistair Snopes had hired them, not just to set the fire, but to ensure Walton and Rosalind didn't escape it. This was no longer blackmail, it was attempted murder. When the sheriff and his posse rode into town to arrest Snopes, they found him, but it was too late. He was in his office at the bank, a single self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. He had chosen a coward's way out, leaving a final, signed confession on his desk. In it, he admitted to the years of extortion, and he admitted to one more thing. On that final afternoon 3 years ago, he had gone to the Grief's ranch. He had threatened Constance, telling her he would ruin Walton. She had fought back, threatening to expose him herself. There was a struggle. She fell, striking her head on the stone hearth. It was an accident, he claimed. But instead of getting a doctor, he had panicked. He had placed a bottle of laudanum by her bed and made it look like she had taken her own life. It was murder. Walton stood by the smoldering ruins of his barn, the confession in his hand. The truth was finally out, all of it. It was uglier than he could have ever imagined. But it was the truth. Constance hadn't despaired. She had fought. She had died fighting for him. He looked at Rosalind, her face smudged with soot, her eyes reflecting the dawn. This brave, stubborn woman who had shown up at his door as a stranger and had become the partner who helped him reclaim his life. He walked over to her and took her hand. "The barn is gone," he said. "We'll build a new one," she replied, her fingers lacing through his. "It will take time," he said. "We have time," she answered, squeezing his hand. "We have all the time in the world." A year later, they stood on the porch of the ranch house. A new, larger barn stood proudly against the sky, built with the help of all their neighbors. The schoolhouse was overflowing with children. The cattle herd was growing. The ranch wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Walton slid a simple silver wedding band onto Rosalind's finger. It was a ring he had bought with the first real profits from their new life. "We married once as strangers for survival," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd like to ask you now, Rosalind Greaves, if you'll stay my wife, as my partner, my friend, my love." Her sage green eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Yes, Walton," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Their first real kiss as husband and wife wasn't one of desperation or convenience. It tasted of wood smoke, prairie dust, and the promise of a future they had built together from the ashes of the past. As they stood there, Rosalind noticed a patch of wild morning glories had sprung up along the fence line, their brilliant blue faces turned toward the sun. They were growing where nothing had been planted, blooming where no one ever expected them to. Just like them, they had found their way not to a second chance, but to a first chance, a real one, together. Do you believe that the most beautiful things can grow in the most unexpected places? That even after the worst storms, something new can bloom? If this story moved you, please hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of survival, secrets, and the surprising strength of the human heart. And share this with someone who needs to be reminded that it's never too late to start building again.